Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carrie Fernandez. I am the current president of APA California, and happy to be joining on this latest installment of the Wildfire Recovery Webinar Series, hosted by APA California, with the help also with uh, California Planning Roundtable and many others. Today's session is titled The Role of Nonprofits in Recovery from the Eaton and Palisades Fires. We'll explore how community-based organizations and philanthropy are shaping recovery on the ground. The session highlights the critical contributions of nonprofits and self-organized groups, many formed after the fires, and how planners can better align with these grassroots efforts. We're excited to have two speakers who both bring personal experience and professional insight into community-led recovery and resilience. The session is eligible for one AICP CM credit, including the mandatory sustainability and resilience credit. So please be sure to log your attendance after the event. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Rob, to introduce our speakers and kick off the discussion. Thanks, Rob.
Great. Thanks a lot, Carrie. And you covered the general introduction for me, so that's great. So just to let you know, we're going to have the presentations going about a half hour. And then I have, I'll ask them some follow-up questions. And of course, we always have the chat and Q&A open, and we'll be taking questions in the latter part. So what we have today, we have first we have Andrew King, who does community recovery and survivor advocacy with the Department of Angels. And for that organization, he's engaged in activities to support community resilience. Notably, Andrew lost his home in the Eaton fire, so this is all he's seeing this from all angles. And then secondly, we have Lily Bui, who's the Director of Climate and Disaster Preparedness and Resilience at SoCal Grantmakers, through which she's helping to support equitable disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery funding. And on our webpage, they have links to both of them. You can find out, read more about their bios if you want there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. It's a pleasure to be here. And here we go. So yes, as Rob said, my name is Andrew King. I am from the Department of Angels, and I want to share a little bit about a survey that we had conducted in June that surveyed about 1,900 survivors in both Palisades, Malibu, and Altadena. This is the most statistically significant survey that's been administered so far to get a good sense of the needs of survivors in both communities. But first, I want to talk about who the Department of Angels is. You may have heard of our organization, but the Department of Angels is an independent nonprofit that was started up in February of this year, immediately in response to the January mega fires. The organization exists to make sure that fire-impacted communities are able to lead their own recovery and not have recovery done to them. We connect lived experiences with real influence, and we like to think that we serve as the nexus or trusted link between government, philanthropy, civic leaders, and the survivors on the ground. A lot of the work that we do is in helping build the capacity of these emergent organizations that have come about since the fires. A lot of these organizations are survivors that are banding together to organize their community. They are, or survivors that are organizing direct relief, they are doing advocacy work. And so a lot of the work that we're trying to do is to ensure that these organizations are both funded, they have the resources that they need to continue. And because this work is so deeply important and also deeply difficult, we want to ensure that these organizations can stick around for the long term. Our name is a bit of a misnomer, though. While we are called the Department of Angels, we are a small team of 6, but we are agile and we have a lot of different skill sets, but we're very proud to do this work here in Southern California and Los Angeles. And on our team, actually, we have 2 survivors, myself and Angela Giacchetti, who also is part of the the Altadena community. This part is likely not a surprise to any of you, but we're going to be talking about the 2 fire-impacted communities in Altadena, where nearly all of Altadena was covered by the fire, and the Palisades, where, again, the fire nearly covered all of Palisades, as well as half of Malibu. Based on a survey that we will go over in just a little bit, the survey really highlighted 4 key priorities that we're currently focusing on. But this is a survey that we are administering quarterly. And so we've done 2, and we're in the process of developing a 3rd, and then we'll do a 4th. But the 4 current priorities that we have right now is 1, 100% community outreach. Fundamentally, we believe that no one should be going through this recovery alone. And so we're working on ways to ensure that we're able to reach every single survivor as best as we can. 3 other things that have come up since the survey include environmental safety and health, insurance access and accessibility, and then housing stability. All 4 of these are current priorities because we have seen the impact that they will have if we do not address these in order for families to be able to return to their homes and have their level of recovery that they're seeking. So I'm going to jump right in. Despite what many of you might have heard or believe, currently at this time, there's still mass displacement. About 8 in 10 pre-fire residents of Altadena, 9 in 10 residents of Pacific Palisades, and nearly half of residents of Malibu are still not at home, despite this being 6 months after the fire. So in total, or on average, across all of Los Angeles, for those that are impacted, 7 in 10 survivors are still not home, and they are in some type of temporary housing. But that temporary housing and that housing instability is actually quite unstable. And people have had to keep moving and will need to keep moving. And so this unstable living condition is what is impacting many survivors. In fact, when we did the survey, survivors had indicated that 32% of them were living in unstable temporary housing while they waited to return. And 17% of them expect to have to move again in the next few months, despite having relocated many times already. In fact, one of the largest numbers that I've heard from one of my neighbors is they had to relocate 26 times in the last 8 months, just to make sure that they were able to stay on someone's couch, maybe get a hotel room, an Airbnb that will only allow them for 2 weeks. And they also did not want to overstay the welcome of friends or family. And so this is the experience that many survivors are having as they are trying to, run that clock until they can move back home. And this is regardless of whether or not they are have lost their home completely, or if their homes are standing, but they can't return home because they are still contaminated. This is compounded by the fact also that most of these survivors that are staying in temporary housing are only doing so because they have insurance coverage that will actually cover their ability to stay in temporary housing. But within a year, roughly 60% of those displaced will have no loss of use, additional living expenses, or for fair rental value. What that means, and just a quick refresher for those of you that need a bit of debrief on how insurance or home insurance works, is that there are 3 basic categories that you have. You have dwelling coverage that pays for the home and structures. You have personal property coverage that will pay for your things. And then the loss of use pays for temporary housing in the event you can't live in your home. This is the same thing that would happen if, let's say, there was a flood in your home and your sink overflowed and you have to replace all the floors so it's uninhabitable till the mold gets remediated. This is the same type of coverage, but this is the coverage that we're using for homes that were destroyed by the fire or are currently contaminated. And unfortunately, a year from now, like I said, 6 in 10 of those who are displaced will have no remaining coverage for their temporary housing. And this places a dramatic series of challenges for folks who have yet to know how long it will actually take to get home, especially when you have estimates that it might take 2, 3, 4 years. If 6 in 10 are going to run out of remaining coverage for temporary housing, you really have to start thinking about what are their alternatives going to be. The reality is most people still want to rebuild, however, but they are experiencing significant financial and logistical hurdles that they're really struggling with. And they continue to have fears about contamination and fire safety. And so we are optimistic because families do want to return home. In fact, you have 88% of people that want to come back home in Altadena and 83% that want to come back home in Palisades. And 82 that want to return in Malibu. But the reality is they have these major financial hurdles. They have these soil contamination hurdles and fire safety concerns that need to be addressed in order to make them feel comfortable to go back home. So because of that, there is a lot of support for policies that one will help streamline the rebuilding process and ideally shorten that time frame for them to return home. But they also want to know that there's going to be improved infrastructure so that their community will be safer. And lastly, while they are trying to figure out how they either can come together with all that money to come home, they want to prevent speculation because they're deeply concerned about the communities that they're going to be coming back home to. And so as you can see here, and I'll leave this slide up for a second, the vast majority, like I said, support policies promoting fire resistance infrastructure, expedited permits, and anti-speculation. Not surprising, there's a lot of support for infrastructure improvements, upgrading power lines, fire resistance infrastructure, fast tracking permits, anti-speculation. There's less support, however, for things like stronger building standards because there is a concern about costs associated with that. There's also less support for temporary housing for displaced residents, and then even less support for allowing more housing near transit. And what we attribute this to a variety of factors, and so just know that overall, there continues to be support, but not nearly as much for these last three. All that to say, being a survivor continues to be incredibly exhausting, and over 80% of those who are displaced report a decline in their mental health, with over 44% noting that that decline was actually much worse than it was previously. And so 80% generally worse and much worse, but 44% of those much worse, nearly half. And again, as a survivor myself, I can attest to the fact that you have your day job trying to, I was a high school principal actually 12 weeks ago before I changed my career to be in nonprofit disaster recovery, and trying to run a school for my students in downtown Los Angeles while also trying to navigate the rebuilding and recovery and navigate FEMA and insurance was a lot. And so I found myself not being able to do both. And so I left my job as a principal, but I found my way to do this work. And so now during the day, I try to support, not the recovery of everyone. And then at night, I try to focus on my own personal recovery for my family. But it is quite a bit. All that to say, though, is that there is an opportunity to recognize that you as planners actually have a lot of power to give hope and energy and provide an affirmative vision for those of us who have lost our homes, who our homes are still contaminated, and are currently drowning in the grief of paperwork and minutia. And so as I've come to learn about your profession, I strongly believe that you are in a very strong position to be able to help communities see the opportunities from the ash and bring survivors out of this grief to hope. And like I said, find an affirmative vision. And so a couple of suggestions that I've kind of thought about as we were preparing for this session is one, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, especially if you are not in the impacted communities, we really looking to anyone, but especially planners, to respond with humility and coordination. There are legacy nonprofits and community-based organizations that are already on the ground leading the recovery, but they will likely need your skill sets to be a sounding board of how they can more effectively reach those that are unreached, or to be able to navigate and coordinate where all this infrastructure and support should go. You also have a really strong ability to highlight the connections between housing and infrastructure and community needs, because you have a strong sense of what is in that community, and we look to your skill sets for that. And lastly, when you come down to help any of these communities, meet people where they are. While you may want to approach it with all these visionary great ideas, initially there's really going to be a need just for urgent needs initially. And so responding with humanity is going to be really key. After the fire, or rather before the next fire, and when you're trying to plan for the communities that you're currently in, we strongly suggest that you work on trying to make wildfire mitigation beautiful. Right now, there's this huge pushback because they feel like when you do fuel modification and community hardening, that's ugly. But the reality is there are really beautiful ways to home harden your home and your community, and we want to see this as an enhancement and not a burden. You also have the ability to be able to plan land use and vegetation infrastructure for safety and resilience that, community members like myself really don't have the vision for or really understand how that works. And so being able to take your knowledge and communicate that to survivors like myself goes a long way in helping us better understand, what are the options out there and the trade-offs. Lastly, especially for areas like the Palisades, but also here in Altadena, where we had a very complicated evacuation, strengthening what those evacuation processes can look like before the fire, really thinking about defensible spaces, and again, community-wide readiness. How do you strategically, do the outreach and ensure that whether it's block by block or neighborhood by neighborhood or community district by community district, you provide that level of community-wide readiness. On the inspirational leadership lens of all of these things, we really hope that when planners come to help envision for the future or help us envision now, reimagine, don't just redevelop. There is a rare chance to be able to fix what's been broken historically, and that may be fixing things like housing and transportation and public spaces. And we only know our community for what it was because we're still trying to bring back what we had. But there is an opportunity to really help us understand that we can bring back or we can introduce new things like more trees and benches on right of ways and plazas and accessible streets and bike paths for our children and electric trolleys that'll go up the hills. I think there is such a unique opportunity to be excited. But right now, so many of us are so focused on our individual rebuild. We need help being able to see community recovery. And I think that's where planners come in. And so we need you to bring people along in the visioning so that you can help us with your vision. Move us from grief to hope, like I've said, use temporary solutions and pilots as a proof of concept to show us what is possible. And let vision grow in step with trust and healing. I think as I've learned more and more about what planners do, it actually makes me realize that the visionary work comes from a lot of you. And so we're hoping that you can do that for the communities that you're serving in, but we also welcome that help here in Los Angeles. What the last thing I'll say here is that there are other additional opportunities that I won't get into today, but these are items that I know communities are currently struggling with, our nonprofits partners are currently struggling with, are hoping to find some resolution. So whether it's outreach and public engagement, environmental health and safety, insurance access, housing stability, nonprofit coordination, infrastructure coordination, community redevelopment, or wildfire mitigation. These 8 are priorities of many of the folks in our community, whether they're CBOs or emergent nonprofits or even, just like the government. But we're really hoping to have your support as sounding boards or even coming in to help us with this work. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Lily, who is going to talk about SoCal Grantmakers.
Thanks, Andrew. And I already have so much that I want to be in dialogue with you after listening to your presentation, even though I've seen versions of this before. I'm, first of all, just really grateful to have you as a thought partner and a community partner. Department of Angels is a newer initiative, but just to make sure that everyone on this call understands, they've come a really long way in terms of forming trusted partnerships with all of the different groups on the ground, many of which are new, and organizing themselves to make sure that survivor voices are heard and survivor needs are met. And so just to introduce myself, I work for SoCal Grantmakers, which is a nonprofit that convenes philanthropic funders in Southern California. I'm just realizing now the date on my slide is from earlier this week, so caught red-handed for reusing some content here. But by way of additional background, I went to planning school, so that's what I got my doctorate in, but a very special focus on disaster risk reduction. And so everything that I am presenting comes from that framework and lens. And I know that many of you on this call work in California, but not all of you might be familiar with the LA context. And so hoping to provide kind of a higher level perspective of the systems that are in place and that are not in place. You can go to the next slide. One thing to note right away is that most of the damage and loss from an economic perspective in our region was loss of structures, and particularly residential structures, so homes. And this is largely one of the reasons why wildfires cost so much more than any other hazard. You'll see at the right side of the screen the average FEMA Individual Households Program Award between 2015 and 2024 was about 10,000 per household for wildfires, and that outperforms all different types of disasters, including hurricanes. And it's because of this damage to structures that tends to make them so much more expensive. You can go to the next slide. And this points to why this particular set of fires is so different from others that we've seen in the state. This set of wildfires that affected the Palisades and Eaton areas is an urban conflagration. And that poses very unique challenges in terms of the scale of the recovery, the cost, and complexity. We received one major disaster declaration for two very distinct burn scars, but even within those burn scars, we have multiple jurisdictions and very different places that are at the core of people's identity. So it's not as simple as even having Palisades and Eaton. There's Altadena, there's Malibu, and there's Topanga that help people self-identify with that sense of place. And also we have City of LA, County of LA, and unincorporated County of LA involved. So that makes it all the more complex to figure out, well, who's in charge of that unified vision and strategic planning that Andrew is pointing to. We have a wealth of data that was consolidated by Department of Angels, as well as other white papers and research initiatives, but determining who the decision makers need to be has become complex because of this multi-jurisdictional nature. We also have a lot of uncertainty around federal support. This is the first presidential declaration that has had to navigate a new administration, clawbacks in government funding, changes in FEMA personnel and leadership, and the future of the actual agency. And then, of course, the systemic tensions that pre-existed these fires, statewide insurance retreat, the housing and climate crisis, and cascading emergencies. We know that disasters tend to overlap, especially throughout long recoveries. And so we are already experiencing that with wildfire season being in tow, a recent tsunami warning even in California, and overlapping emergencies like the recent ice enforcement in LA. Next slide. And so from where we sit in philanthropy, we've been able to have a landscape view of what philanthropic funders have done. And when I say philanthropic funders, I'm referring to a very broad spectrum of players. This represents community foundations, private and family foundations, corporate philanthropy, high net worth individuals and giving circles, and a lot of in between, a lot of new players. So you may have been following the news. The LA Times has not been easy to navigate. There's a lot of different stories told at different points in time, but the collective number that we've arrived at is about $840 million collectively raised across philanthropy in Southern California. And there have been, by my count, at least 70 funders who have activated funds or giving programs during this disaster event. And some of those funders have never done disaster philanthropy before, and they've never deployed alongside federal players like FEMA before. And so our collaborative that we ended up standing up provides that funder education, but coordination, given the vast amount of money that was raised, but the decentralization of those dollars. At this point in time, around the 7-month mark, we know that half of that 840 million was spent down, with the remainder meant to be dispersed over the long arc of recovery, which is in and of itself another type of challenge. Next slide. And the reason for this being a lot of philanthropic dollars for disaster tend to be allocated towards response and relief, about 82% based on data from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. And a very small percentage of dollars raised tends to be mandated for reconstruction and recovery, which arguably is more complex and more expensive. These are well-known trends across different types of disasters. It's not just this one. We try to uplift best practices and influence funders to make sure that there's a set aside for recovery, but we've yet to see the movement in that direction across the scale, there is still a bit of inertia in that behavior because of the media cycle and the attention that usually is received during those early days after a disaster event. Next slide. And on top of the wildfire, philanthropic funders have been called to backfill a lot of the government funding that has been lost by nonprofits due to clawbacks in government funding or frozen government funding or outright canceled government funding. So not only are nonprofits impacted by the wildfires and trying to sustain themselves after the fact, they're also trying to make sure that they can make up for the loss in government funds. And this is coming from research by Candid that to make up for the loss of government grants, private foundations would have to increase their grant making by 282%, which is simply not possible. And so this shows you the type of pressure that is falling on the philanthropic sector at this time. And next slide. And then just based on what we know about wildfires, and this is based on a 5-year average between 2017 and 2021 in California, a period during which we saw a lot of mega fires, the average annual loss by wildfires is about 117 billion. And we know that philanthropy at its best can raise hundreds of millions. And that's a gap that's just far too big for philanthropy to be that load-bearing weight. Hence the need to work across sectors with a lot of different partners in government, the private sector, with nonprofits, and with anyone else who wants to come to the table as part of that coalition of the willing. Next slide. I know we're almost at time. I will get through the rest of the presentation succinctly. And so what we observe is a wide spectrum of capital in disaster recovery. And so the image is the National Disaster Recovery Framework. You may or may not be familiar with it, but if you're not, this shows you a timeline of how recovery tends to work. There is short-term recovery, which kind of borders on relief and emergency needs, and then you enter intermediate and long-term recovery through months and years after. The closer you are to the disaster event, the more types of perishable capital you will tend to see. So cash relief, microgrants, rapid response funds, just general operating support. And these tend to be in maybe the hundreds or lower thousands in amount. And then as we get into long-term recovery, the requirement for patient capital tends to increase. So program-related investments, recoverable grants, lending and debt, and public-private partnership. And as we move towards long-term recovery, we're seeing the need grow and grow, where if you'll remember that chart from Center for Disaster Philanthropy, the percentage of philanthropic dollars for recovery tends to be the least. Next slide. What we're tracking now through our funder collaborative are the different areas of recovery that the National Disaster Recovery Framework organizes itself around. So we have funder tables that mirror the recovery support functions. So we have funder roundtables and groups that organize around housing and infrastructure, economic recovery, health, education, and social services, natural and cultural resources, and community planning and capacity building. And that last one is where the nonprofit capacity building work really lives. Next slide. And another thing that I'll uplift is that funders cannot make decisions in silos. We can't simply just tell people to write checks. It needs to be guided by local voices and really be locally led. And so we're seeing the formation of long-term recovery groups, which is a formal cooperative body that normally we only see one after a disaster, but we are seeing at least 2 at the moment and likely more. I have a slide for that as well, but the reason why I bring this up is because this is the infrastructure through which disaster case managers can identify resources for individuals and families who are mapping out their plan. And then with any kind of unmet needs, let's say after you figure out what insurance will pay for, what FEMA individual assistance will pay for, and what you have in your bank, if there's still a gap, those needs get presented at an unmet needs funder roundtable. Next slide. And so like I mentioned, there are multiple long-term recovery groups that seem to be emerging. So we have a very decentralized recovery. Going back to that point I made about multiple jurisdictions, we also have multiple LTRGs. So the 2 that have that are color coded by yellow have formally received their designation, and the others are still coming together, but we fully anticipate that they will organize at some point. And so the question from a plannerly perspective becomes, how do we work in this decentralized mode? How do funders plug into this architecture so that they can deeply listen to what the needs are, where everyone seems to be uplifting needs in different ways in different places? What is the most efficient way of doing things that serves the needs that are coming into the light? I don't know if I have another slide after that, actually, because I wanted to land on that question. You are definitely catching us in the middle of figuring out a lot and coming up with models that didn't exist before, because every disaster is different. But I'm hoping that between the two of our presentations, you get a lay of the land in terms of what we're grappling with at the moment.
Well, thanks both of you. That's a lot of stuff. I'll tell you certainly what struck me between the two of your presentations was Andrew telling us that approximately half of the households in all the different fire affected areas, they really want to return, and they're just not sure that they can. It depends on whether or not their financial needs are going to be met. And then we have Lily telling us that now we're entering into the long-term recovery period, and those financial needs are in terms of philanthropy, are sort of the hardest ones to be able to get enough interest to be able to raise the money. And this is really a key period that's going to determine whether people are going to be able to meet their personal recovery goals or not. So I'm going to start with kind of a large question. I've been trying to, wrap my head around the growing the ecosystem of all the different new organizations, and both of you are interacting with a lot of them in a lot of different ways. And I know we can't. Anyway. I know we can't have a clear and definitive answer, but if each of you can just give us just a little more of a flavor of some of the types and amounts of new community organizations and various kinds of nonprofits that have arisen that are responding to resident needs, and then I'm just kind of wondering, how this, and you've already alluded to it, how this ecosystem is slowly learning how to coordinate among themselves, and I know both of you are deeply involved in trying to improve that. So anyway, that's kind of a big one, but just a little appetizer, if each of you can provide for us, would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, I can briefly talk about the on the ground folks. So a little bit after a couple weeks after the fire, you started seeing a couple of outcrops of not community-based organizations, nonprofits that were trying to emerge to respond to a gap that they were seeing. So in both Palisades and Eaton Fire, two groups emerged called All Together, which is a neighborhood block captain group, and Team Palisades, which is another neighborhood block captain group. And those groups are their sole goal is to try to do localized community organizing, possibly by block, possibly by census tract. But the idea is that they want to ensure that neighbors are connected to be able to be reliable, trusted sources, be able to share their survivor expertise when they're navigating insurance, and just ensure that. I mean, a really good example is you have all these philanthropic organizations giving out money, but it's only dependent, it only goes to the people if they know that it exists. And so one quick anecdote is I remember a Catholic church giving away money, and it was posted on a WhatsApp group. I called and I was able to receive some funding for my family. And 2 minutes later, a neighbor posted they already ran out. And this is just like over and over again, something that happens. And so the reality is we wanted to connect people because who you're connected to really does determine your recovery. You also have several advocacy groups that are issue-oriented that are emerging. Many folks that Resilient Palisades and Eaton Fire Residents United that are really doing soil and environmental contamination, ash and smoke contamination in homes. You have Eaton Fire Survivors Network that's really trying to do insurance advocacy. And then you have some smaller groups that have kind of pivoted away from just doing neighborhood organizing to relief organizing. And I think Lily can speak to that a little bit more, that are now trying to figure out how do they fit disaster recovery into their portfolio. And so what we're seeing is a lot of capacity building need, a lot of groups who want to be nonprofits, but they don't actually know what that means. And maybe they just want to help people. And so there's a lot of information and knowledge that these groups still need in order to be effective in a long-term sense.
Yeah, I'll add to that, just dovetailing off of that last comment. Because there were so many emergent groups and coalitions that formed after the fires, in this moment of almost a pause as we figure out what that next tranche of funding looks like and the next big step and phase of disaster recovery looks like for all groups involved, we've seen that each time there is a funding opportunity posted, for example, from American Red Cross, it really motivates a lot of groups to figure out, well, do we need fiscal sponsorship? And if so, where can we go for that? What is a fiscal sponsorship? Or how do you put together an executive leadership team and then craft a mission statement and put together a board? We're seeing a lot of groups that are brand new that need that level of guidance and are trying to keep up with different funding cycles. So funders have actually listened to that and become aware that this is going to be necessary to usher newer groups into whatever pathway they choose for themselves. So that capacity building roundtable that I mentioned is led by Annenberg Foundation and California Community Foundation, and they have realized that there will be a need for almost cohort-based models to provide leadership training and education for nonprofits to onboard themselves onto what it means to become a formalized 501c3 or to remain fiscally sponsored, how to access grants and do fundraising on the ground. So I also want to point you all to some research that the Center for Nonprofit Management SoCal did almost immediately after the fires to get a sense of how nonprofits were impacted. These were existing nonprofits in the burn scar. So about, I want to say, almost 5,000 nonprofits were in the burn scar. And based on what the survey found, a lot of them need capacity building support that includes support for the long-term recovery groups that have formed because they will be very central. And in other disasters, those LTRGs have been pass-throughs for millions of dollars potentially for unmet needs. So building capacity on the ground for the executive teams of those LTRGs to handle administratively and logistically that level and scale of support is going to be important. We're also hearing about a lot of need to provide mental health resources to staff and nonprofit leaders and community members because many of these organizations are frontline organizations and they've been on the ground working nonstop. And so mental health support for them has been surfaced as a need. And of course, the direct financial assistance. I think we've yet to figure out what a sector-wide strategy for sustaining nonprofits is going to look like, but there have been conversations among funders to collaborate with each other to fund different tranches. So perhaps one funder has an RFP, a request for proposals in year one, and then the next funder will step in to fund year two and year three. So we've seen conversations like that happen. And then in the interim, coordination has happened to the extent of sharing criteria for grant applications so that it reduces the burden on nonprofits and grant-seeking organizations to access capital. So instead of having nuanced, bespoke proposals and applications for each opportunity for funders to share their criteria so that grant-seeking organizations just essentially have to apply one way. There have been other conversations about a common application. I will say that with 70 plus funders, it has been challenging to try to coordinate that scale, but that conversation will keep happening. And my prediction is that we'll see players drop off as they spend down to zero their wildfire funds, and we'll get a better sense of who those central players will be for the long, long term.
Great, thanks. You know, I think it was a few weeks ago, I had I forget, it was a question from the press sort of asking how this recovery compares to, you know, other recoveries from other disasters, as if it were like a past tense kind of a thing. And I appreciate, and I'm glad we're having this today. You guys are making it really clear to everybody that the recovery really hasn't begun yet. And we're still figuring out how to do it. So again, this is really a very, very critical stage. Incidentally, you know, I would just earlier today, I was reading an article on issues of housing foreclosures in Lahaina. It's kind of useful. They're like a year ahead of us, and all the stuff that they're going through there are things that we can remind us of the issues that still lie ahead here. Anyway, excuse me. So along that line, could have sort of another. Well, yeah, we'll try to get this one in quickly, but it's sort of the issue of unmet needs, and you guys have covered a lot of it. And we've been, you know, certainly talking, and we're talking from the point of view of nonprofits and philanthropic resources. But you guys are also working, interacting with city, county, state, maybe some federal, I don't know. What additional resources would you like to see from some of these entities moving forward, and maybe hope that we still might be able to see from some of them helping communities to recover?
I can start. I think strengthening public-private partnerships is going to be a big part of it, at least from the philanthropic perspective, simply because we belong to a broader ecosystem. We're part of the pie, right? I think in my presentation, I used the language that we cannot be the load-bearing weight for recovery. And so understanding what kind of guidance can come from local government will be helpful in that visioning process and to motivate movement in a direction that people can tack onto or supplement. And so I think there is already a lot of leadership from LA County, in particular, I'll just name Department of Economic Opportunity as really taking the lead on supporting small business and workers. They've really developed muscle around understanding who their base is and building a map of what businesses exist, which didn't exist before the fires. So they've been doing a lot of outreach and been able to provide capital and have a shop local, dine local campaign that they are starting to really support small businesses to prevent their displacement and to help people keep the lights on. And so this is a case in which there is a clear local government lead, and then philanthropic partners have been able to supplement the funds that they've stood up, or to make sure that if there is a gap, then they're making grant opportunities available to fill those gaps. So maybe the worker fund is a cash relief that covers 5,000 or 10,000. And if a business owner or a worker still has some bridge gap needs for permitting, then philanthropy can design a request for proposals around that. Or things like, well, I still need groceries and I need cash cards for gas in order to get through my day-to-day. So those are the ways in which public and private and philanthropic partnerships can really come together. And that is one aspect of recovery, which is, I would say, under the economic recovery support function, but this can also happen in housing and infrastructure, in health, and in other areas of recovery. I think mapping out those relationships and those verticals is going to be crucial to getting systems in place so that they can keep moving as public financing becomes available through the state, and that can be leveraged against philanthropic capital.
I don't have much else to add, but I think just some other ideas that I've seen kicked around that I think could be possible is that in the absence of federal government funding at the moment, I mean, we would still love to see federal appropriation dollars and CBDGR grants coming into California and Los Angeles to help close that gap. But in the meantime, you know, we are a significantly large economy. And so if there was a way to bond our way out of this, I would love to have someone have the courage just to say a small 0.05% tax increase might actually be able to close that gap a little bit. I think there's also a need for that visioning work that I was talking about and really having the the county or the city, whichever jurisdiction makes the most sense, to really take the lead on bringing these community members together, because there's a lot of pop-ups right now, but we really need an umbrella organization that has the gravitas to bring everyone together. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of unintentional infighting, because this is such a painful thing to talk about, and yet everyone is trying to do their best. And so I think a lot of leadership in that regard would be wonderful, because then it allows people to point to a leader, and it's someone with all existing positional power versus those that are trying to claw for it in ways that are a little bit difficult.
Great, thanks. So I hear from both of you. Obviously, money would be very helpful, but more continuing and more leadership and more visioning by local governments would be really very helpful in not only helping the governmental programs to work better, but it can help to better coordinate again this ecosystem of all the nonprofits. So I hope some of them are listening. And speaking of the people listening, I know one thing that both of you really wanted was for us to try and get some sort of make a plea to some of the planners and get some ideas for what they might be able to do. I really liked Andrew's slide. It was very concise and inspirational. I think had a lot of the things that we should be getting, I think, from some of the local governments and some of the things that planners can provide. And I wish we could, and maybe we'll think of some way to distribute that plea more widely. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know both of you wanted to say a few things about ways in which you'd like planners to support you. And nobody has sent anything into the Q&As, but if you can ask them a couple of good pointed cues that you want answers to, maybe we can get some input from them. So I'll turn that over to you guys to do this.
I can start, Andrew, and maybe we can tee up each other. When we were designing this conversation, we were trying to figure out what we could ask a room full of planners. And I say this having also been trained and educated as a planner, but I don't work as a planner for the city of LA or county of LA. And so I think one of the strengths of a planning perspective tends to be planners' ability to integrate. And so, as you can see, it's not for lack of data about needs that we don't have guidance and leadership, right? But I think what we want to crowdsource here is your recommendation on how we can better work with our local planners, so that we can be asking the right questions or motivating the right kind of movement to make sure that these visioning processes are prioritized, because we're at a moment where there is, at this point, quarterly survey data from the Department of Angels. We have partners who have organized across sectors. We have a sense of the impact of philanthropic dollars, but how do we pull it all together into some sort of integrative vision? And I should also note that we do have, a set of recommendations from a Blue Ribbon Commission that was an independent body that was put together by one of our Board of Supervisors to make recommendations towards rebuilding with resilience in mind and not simply rebuilding like for like. So we have a lot to work with, but what does it mean to put it all together? And what are your recommendations as planners on how to approach this conversation in such a decentralized recovery? And Andrew, feel free to add your take on it as well.
I have a separate question, but I would love to hear anyone who has thoughts on that first. And I don't know how that works.
Are people able to come off mic?
I don't know.
Oh, I see
We do
something.
have a question. So let's see. We have a question says, and Miguel is raising his hand there too. I guess okay. Well, anyway, so have your organizations or others been tracking differences in local needs based on whether someone was renting, owning, or in a mobile home? Curious about the different needs.
So the survey that we did in Q2 did distinguish between different types if you're an owner or a renter, and it did also distinguish if they were in a mobile home, I think, especially for those living in Palisades. So we can disaggregate the data this way. One thing that we hope to do in Q3 survey is to gather more detailed data about specific needs, because I think that's going to help us understand what specifically philanthropy or government can do to specifically meet these needs. But the other thing is that with the disaster case management program now fully started, there is a team of 5 different nonprofits that are providing disaster case management to these survivors. And hopefully they'll also be able to let us know what those needs are. But I would say, even though we're 8 months in, it's still pretty new, and we're still trying to get a better sense of accurate data to give a sense of what the needs are actually out there.
Thanks. And I see, so Miguel, who has the ability, I guess, to turn on his mic. Does he? Here we go.
I'm not seeing any hands raised in response to my question, which is fine. But Andrew, maybe you can ask yours.
Okay. And apologies, my kids are going crazy upstairs. The question that I have for all of you actually is about information. And so I am in the process of getting ready to launch the Q3 survey. What information do you feel like you would need in order to better serve survivors in recovery? And it's okay if we already have those data points. And obviously, I shared only a couple pieces of data with you all, but I'm really trying to get a sense of what information do people need so that they can, take action or influence their decision making so that we can help these folks recover faster.
Okay. And we'll see if anybody else wants to get it. So Miguel says his mic didn't work. You can type your question, Miguel. I keep wondering if there's any role for planning volunteers. You sort of alluded to, Andrew, but there's hard to see a structure in this at this point. But I'm sure that if opportunities arose that, a lot of planners or either organized through our chapter or individually, would be happy to volunteer in some to help neighborhood groups and so on. But I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about whether we could have, what the potential for that would be and what it might take to be able to do that.
I know it would be welcome. So, I mean, a lot of these newer nonprofits are emergent and they're still trying to figure themselves out and they're still trying to figure out their capacity and resources. But having someone help sit with them and just probe and ask questions and offer a different perspective, I think would be immensely powerful in terms of being able to get a better sense of what is within their locus of control, what are the things that they haven't thought about, and how do systems work? I think the biggest thing that survivors struggle with, that they're not already in government or in positions of power or connected, is they don't know how to navigate this very convoluted system of disaster recovery, and a planner might have that bird's eye view to let them see how all the connections work together.
And if we wanted to understand, you identified some of the organizations. There's no real umbrella group or anything. Where would be useful points of entry for planners who wanted to help?
I mean, if planners wanted to offer to volunteer, they are welcome to reach out to me. Again, I'll put my email in the chat, and I can connect you with a variety of different groups. If there are particular interests that you have, if you want to do environmental safety, insurance, advocacy, recovery, rebuilding, coordination, there's a lot of folks that are really hoping, that really need some type of thought partner in the landscape of systems. And I think any one of them would benefit. Even within these 2 block captain groups, they now have their own little offshoots that are working groups trying to figure out things like undergrounding power lines and navigating school redevelopments because some of the schools burned down. And so I think they would absolutely benefit from just thought and sounding board conversations and being able to see like what is possible.
I was just thinking, I wonder how many Cal APA members have been directly affected by the fires. I know there must be quite a few of them in both of those communities. Anyway, something for us to find out. I think I'm looking at the clock. I think we're kind of getting down towards the end. Oh, there's Miguel and Miguel's comment. So he says, I wanted to address Lily's question. I think this is a good time to reimagine how planners operate as while we are great at collaborating, we still operate in silos. We need to build big coalitions and alliances to stay a lot in the absence of traditional tools we have. That's a good, anyway, good point. And I guess our continuing question here is how we might best go about doing that. And I don't know if either of you have comments, and we're down to our last couple of minutes.
Just wanted to respond to Miguel's comment. I think that, so yes, +1 on all that. And then part of my theory on the reason why we're seeing so many different coalitions and alliances is likely in the absence of that stronger governance and leadership. And this is not a critique on governance. I think there's a lot of trust in the ability of LA to self-organize, which has already happened. But now that we have all of these coalitions, they need to be guided. There needs to be a system of systems. And so we're at this point where people have their trusted coalitions and partners that they're willing to go with, but then what? Who links them to each other, right? And it brings up this question of that bridging social capital that is needed for connective tissue so that we can all move together. And that, I think, is the role of planners, is to integrate all of the above now that we've arrived at this point. And then Katie had a question about permit review. I dropped some links in the chat. I see that Matt also is on it from LA County. So happy to answer any other questions as well. Both Andrew and I left our contact information on our slides, and I imagine they'll be shared, but I'll drop my email in the chat as well.
Great, thank you. This has been really good, and we've ended up on some action items that I think the ball is in our court to try and figure out how to do some of this to move forward. And again, I think you reminded us that the long-term recovery is just at the very beginning right now, and so it's important for us to keep the foot on the pedal and keep moving forward. So with that, thank you so much, both of you. This was really another outstanding session, and I'm going to turn it over to James to wrap us up.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you so much, Andrew and Lily. This has been a really insightful conversation, and it really adds to the rest of the repertoire that we've been building this year with our webinar series. And some of these last comments really do kind of resonate to the planning profession and how we contribute to this, but also think about different ways that we're serving the community in this. So Andrew, I appreciate the invite in terms of the volunteerism, because I know there's a lot of planners who definitely echo a lot of the comments on being at the intersection of many of the things that Lily had pointed out. So definitely very timely comments on that. So definitely appreciate that. On behalf of APA California and the California Planning Roundtable, I want to thank everybody for coming today to this. As far as our next webinar, we're still working on that for September, so stay tuned for some details on that. As we put into the chat, there is AICP credits to log on this, so make sure you do that relatively soon. We're also continuing to work on getting credits for our backlog catalog. So that'll be coming in the next few weeks, and we'll make an announcement and post that on socials when that's ready. But all of our materials are available online. So at the apacalifornia.org site, you can find those on there. So again, thank you everybody for sharing your Friday with us, and a special thanks to Lily and Andrew. Thank you so much for that. And Rob, fantastic job as always moderating. So until next time, thanks all. Have a great weekend.